Now, I want to move on with another senior government figure. That is the Liberal MP, Tim Wilson, who joins us live now from Melbourne. And he's wrapped up, of course, his parliamentary inquiry into Labor's franking tax credit changes. Thanks for joining us, Tim. You dropped that report last week. It got lost in the budget a bit.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, unfortunately, it wasn't able to be tabled until late Thursday, just before the opposition leader's reply. But the substance of the policy of the report doesn't change despite the timing. Nearly 1 million Australian retirees will lose a third of their income on the 1st of July if there's a change of government.
It's hardly surprising you to come to that finding. It was a kind of a political exercise. You wanted to highlight this new tax and you're critical of it. But tell me, what do you think is going to happen here? If Labor gets in and this tax were imposed, wouldn't people just change their investment arrangements so that they don't lose that taxation? And is one of the consequences of that perhaps not as much damage done to the retirees, but Labor not raising as much money as they had expected?
Well, Chris, the recommendation is based on the weight of evidence that the committee came up with. And we had 19 public hearings. Normally at a public hearing of the Economics Committee, we might be lucky to get 5 people from the public. We had meetings with 500. We had more submissions than we could publish within the time frame. That's the volume of content that came in. And the overwhelming majority was very clear that people didn't want to see the retiree tax go ahead. And there are lots of reasons why it shouldn't. On the 1st of July, Australian retirees at risk of losing up to a third of their income. But yes, some people will be able to adjust their finances. Those who are very well off will be able to do so and restructure it. So Peter Costello was at a breakfast the other day, raised the prospect that the retiree tax strangely might lead to less tax revenue like the mining tax. We've seen that before. But there'll be lots of people who can't because they rely on their superannuation for security and they won't know where to go.
Yeah, and I suppose the other consequence of that could be less people in the market for Australian equities, Australian shares, although I wouldn't have thought that impact would be huge. I wonder if Tim Wilson...
Sorry, just for clarity, I disagree with that. What we actually know is that many retirees have deliberately chosen to invest in building this country's future, bought Australian shares because they want to back Australians and because it delivers them the return through their dividends, and that's what's going to be lost. So a huge amount of market capitalisation will go offshore if people are looking at ways to secure the return or the growth on their income so they can have a secure retirement.
Now, as an MP who's keen to make sure tax dollars are well looked after and not wasted, you must be a little embarrassed by the amount of government advertising out there, taxpayer-funded advertising. I've drawn attention to it in the past, over the past couple of months. There's a lot around. There's stacks around now on the eve of the election being called. Labor, of course, having a go at the government about this, but they do the same thing. We've got to have some rules here that in place, don't we? That the government's coalition or Labor on the eve of election can't be spruiking themselves on our coin.
Well, the reality is there are rules, and there are rules that once you go into the campaign period, you can't put public advertising unless it meets certain standards. I think they're right. I think they're the right rules. But the reality is we've got to actually inform the Australian people of what we're doing, particularly because of the challenges we face where, let's face it, we have the most dishonest opposition leader in Australian history who's running around everywhere.
He's forcing you to spend our money talking to us. Come on.
Chris, we have the most dishonest opposition leader in Australian political history running around saying that funding in health, there's been reductions in funding in health and education. It's just simply not true. The facts aren't true. Now, we've been explaining to people this for a long time. We've had advertising explained for a long time. And when it gets to the campaign period, it's appropriate that it has to meet the benchmarks for our government advertising during a campaign. It shouldn't be used and abused to advantage one side. But telling the Australian people the facts so they know what their government is doing is a critical part for anybody who's in office.
Now, Tim Wilson, on another issue, your former colleague Julia Banks, obviously elected to the parliament at the last election under the policies that the Liberal Party was espousing. She's quit the Liberal Party, now going to run as an independent, taking on Greg Hunt in Flinders. She's out today opposing the Adani coal mine in central Queensland, a long way from the Mornington Peninsula, a seat of Flinders, and now she's opposing Adani, apparently the latest issue she's jumped onto. Do you recall at any time her speaking out against the Adani coal mine publicly in Liberal Party forums or in Liberal Party meetings?
I don't recall Ms Banks doing so. I mean, she's chosen to do that. But I say this almost with sadness. Ms Banks has obviously chosen to go down a path where she's decided to go through a sort of a metamorphosis to try and reposition herself. And I think one of the things in politics, you actually have to be upfront and authentic about who you are and what you stand for. And if you're going to go from what she claims she represented before to what she claims to represent now, I don't think she does herself or her community any service.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Tim. Appreciate it.